Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is Jackie Neri Arias, and I'm the director of the Center for Cultural Liberation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm super excited that everyone is at this training. As you all know, we've been having all kinds of conversations about how to support students in leadership positions. And how to make sure that we have opportunities that are inclusive regardless of immigration background, regardless of even course of study, anything like that. So uh, with that, we have today some guests from the President's Alliance and someone who used to work at Pomona but now is now at USC. Miriam and Lauren will introduce themselves, but they've kindly agreed to host a training for us here at Dominican today so that we can learn and how to develop and design inclusive experiential opportunities. So Miriam and Lauren, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. And with that, I am going to share my screen so that I can, let me just make sure I can figure out to move this so I can see how to make this into the present. Let's just, sorry, I'm looking slideshow. Okay. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for Jackie for inviting us. We're really thrilled to be here. And as we were talking to Jackie, this is going to be a learning experience, I think, for all of us, because we're really interested to hear from you about your questions and what you're looking to do and how the President's Alliance can be most supportive and responsive to your needs and to your student needs. So this is actually, very much of a reciprocal relationship whenever I engage with campuses. I'm just so grateful that you're spending your time as well. My name, as Jackie says, Miriam Feldblum. I'm one of the co-founders of the President's Alliance and now serve as executive director. My background, just for you to know, is I spent 30 plus years on college campuses. Most recently, close to a dozen years as the Vice President for Student Affairs, Dean of Students, and Professor of Politics at Pomona College in Claremont, California. And before that was at Caltech and University of San Francisco. I started off as an assistant professor of politics. So I'm also an immigration scholar. So kind of professionally, my field has been in immigration, professionally also as administrator, kind of really working to support students, staff, and faculty. And I will also just to kind of say a little bit about my own positionality working in this area. I'm a second generation immigrant, the daughter of a refugee, a Holocaust survivor who came to the US after World War II as in fact, being able to come to pursue study in the US, and in fact has said later on that education really saved him. So really kind of thinking about each time my own positionality in the work, and also even though the President's Alliance, our members are presidents and chancellors, we think it's critical that we are informed and guided by impacted populations and by the practitioners in the field. And that's how we try to engage in this space. And before going any further, I'm thrilled and honored to also introduce my co-presenter today, Lauren Cardenas, who I had the privilege of working with at Pomona College. And let me turn to her so she can say a little bit about herself.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Jackie, for inviting me here. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Cardenas, and I'm currently an assistant director in career services at the USC Marshall School of Business in Los Angeles, California. Prior to that, I was at Pomona College for about 3 years or so, and in my very first semester at Pomona, that's when I started working on our campus fellows for experiential learning with Miriam. And so that was just, we'll get into it more throughout the presentation. I'll talk you through what that process was like of building a program from the ground up and the lessons learned from that. But then prior to that, I actually got my start in college access nonprofit. So I was actually a trainer at the Posse Foundation, which those of you who may not be familiar with Posse, it's a comprehensive merit leadership scholarship program. And so I was based out of the Los Angeles office, and that was really my first exposure to student affairs in higher ed. Fun fact though, is that 10 years before that, like when I was in high school, I was in a formative, for me, it was a formative experience. It was a summer bridge program at Pomona College where I had met Miriam. And ever since then, she's just been this amazing force, this amazing mentor, and somebody that I really look up to, and, you know, expose me to a lot of people who are doing this work. And so I'm so fortunate now to be where I am and look back and see, right, like the impact of programs like that summer enrichment program, the work of nonprofits, the work that, you know, I get to do in student affairs. And something that I'm looking forward to this fall is starting a Master's of Education program in Student Affairs at USC Rossier. So it's been some time in the making to finally get to that point, but I'm here now and grateful, and I'm really, really glad to be doing this work, and I'm hopeful for the future of non-employment-based fellowship opportunities that are inclusive to folks, no matter their background.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. And I will say just one logistics is I am using a PowerPoint slide, but if it doesn't work, I'm going to go back to my Google slides because I realized already it doesn't always translate. So what are we trying to do here today? First, I know Tanya's here in the room, and it was great to have the Dream.us and Tanya lay out the goals of supporting undocumented students, including those with DACA and work authorization and those without. Here today, we're really going to be focusing on undocumented students without work authorization. So that's the focus of today. And if there's other questions about students with DACA, we can also bring in Tanya as well to talk about some other career development issues. And what we'd like to do today is I'd like to actually take one little step back to talk about what is this population of undocumented students and students without work authorization. The approach that we recommend, it's an approach we recommend. We can talk about the pros and cons to it, delve into how we determine what's possible and what's not, the kinds of funding opportunities you can consider. And then as Lauren said, she's going to actually walk you through how she developed the fellows program and the lessons that she learned. And then I hope we spend the remainder of our time on Q&A. So in terms of populations, we just actually updated these figures this month in March 2021, and they are on our new higher education immigration portal. And the links are on the website, on the PowerPoint, and we're happy to also, I'll put that in the chat later on if you'd like. So there's over 420,000 undocumented students in higher education across the country. The majority of these students are not DACA eligible. And when I say DACA, I'm referring to that 2012 program that Tanya referred to in the last session. They're not eligible, maybe because their date of arrival, you had to arrive by June of 2007, by June of 2007 to be eligible for the 2012 DACA program. And there could be other factors as well. Nationally, overall, there are 181,000 or so of the 427,000 or so who are DACA eligible. With the reopening of DACA in December of 2020, more students, more individuals are applying for DACA. Now, what does this mean for Illinois? You'll see that I also put in the Illinois page in the portal. We think this is we've been getting great feedback. We'd love to hear what you think about it. But it will tell you directly that there are approximately 18,000 undocumented students in higher education in Illinois. Now, I recognize Dominican may also have students from across other states, but just for you to know who's in Illinois. And in Illinois, actually, the percentages are a little less. There are more students who are not eligible for DACA than are eligible, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. Overall in Illinois, also kind of think about the fact that 10% of all students in Illinois are first-generation immigrant students, okay? Majority of first-generation immigrant students are here lawfully. They're not undocumented, right? But just think about their connections to immigration. In addition, another around 19% of students in Illinois are second-generation immigrant students, meaning one or more of their parents were born outside the country. So you have around close to 30% of students in Illinois who are what I would call immigration impacted students. And again, this is not counting international students who are immigration impacted in different ways, but close to 30% of domestic students in Illinois are immigration impacted. So it may not be they themselves who may have, who may be directly connected to a mixed status family or family member or others, but they may have it within their extended family community. The approach that we take and that I want to take here today is to think about this a little bit in concentric circles, in the sense that if you think about undocumented students, at the very center, there could be DACA recipients with work authorization. In 2017, MPI, the Migration Policy Institute, estimated nationally around 124,000 students in higher education are DACA recipients. And those numbers have been going down ever since. And as we said here, not quite 200,000 nationally, around 9,000 in Illinois. So those are the kind of work authorization. And then there are those who are DACA eligible, and then there's undocumented students. Now, if we think also then about another circle of all the students on your campus who have work authorization, one of the things who are citizens, lawful permanent residents, others, one of the things to think about is what I would call a universal approach. Meaning we're not just trying to do a one-off or ad hoc for that slice of the circle who don't have work authorization. But when we're talking about what we're trying to do, we want it to actually apply to as many students as possible, right? And that would be what I would call a universal approach with intentional outcomes, with targeted intentions, so that the outcomes are something that's inclusive to students regardless of immigration status. Now, I will also put to the side here talking about international students and work off campus, because we know that that can be complicated for international students. But to think about work on campus, how do we make as many opportunities as possible inclusive, regardless of immigration status? And not just thinking about, okay, what slice of student do we want to look at? I think, by the way, that's something that for some folks seems counterintuitive. Should we try to target an opportunity for undocumented students? And again, I think that there's ways to do outreach for them, and that's not actually carving out a program. It also, I will mention that as more states put into place provisions that call for non-discrimination on the basis of immigration status, then programs that target, that are only open to undocumented students, have legal issues. The same way that after 2003, colleges and universities had to move away from race-based programs, I think that we would also see this in terms of immigration status-based programs. So there's also a good legal reason to think about it in terms of a universal approach. This chart is from our funding guide, which goes through all the options. I know I've given it to Angie and to others to kind of look through, that there are ways in which students, regardless of immigration status, can participate in internships, especially in terms of internships that are unpaid, and that are off campus, but the campus is providing funding for. That can be considered a non-employment based internship from the perspective of a campus. One of the things that I would recommend for Dominican University to do, if you haven't done so already, is to audit all the programs you have and see what their eligibility is. See what kind of work it is, what kind of position it is. We did this at Pomona College, and then recognize that even though our off-campus internships in which students were getting funding from the college, there was no employer-employee relationship between the student and the college for these summer internships, but we had just put it through payroll because it was the easiest thing to do. We actually moved all these summer internships, I think this was a few years before Lauren came, to non-employment based internships and stipends, and that allowed it to be inclusive to everyone. We kind of legally figured out that, given the nature of the internship funding, this is something we can do. Today, we're really going to talk about fellowships, but I wanted to bring it up in case you have questions about internships, and we're going to talk about to what extent can undocumented students without work authorization participate and be eligible for fellowships that can include research or projects or programs. And we're going to talk about if a fellowship is non-employment based, then they can be eligible for it. I think that what's important here, and the key, and we can go and talk about this in Q&A, is the nature of the work. This is not about semantics, and Lauren will also talk about it, but it really has to do with understanding if the nature of the work is employment-based or not employment-based. I should also note, and this is in a conversation with Angie about talking about fellowships that may be tied to curriculum. So to give you an example, at Emory University, all graduate students get fellowships, and as part of their fellowship, they are required to take a class about teaching, and as part of that class about teaching, there is a TA-ship that they also participate in, that they do. And then they come back to class and they also discuss the TA-ship. So that TA-ship that they're doing for a separate class is actually not employment-based. Usually TA-ships, teaching assistantships are employment-based. But because the way that Emory University had designed its TA-ships for all students, their HR department and lawyers realized it actually was a non-employment-based fellowship opportunity that was accessible to students without work authorization. So there's some creative things that you can do around the nature of the work and where it's tied to that could help structure it as non-employment based. I should also add here that the President's Alliance will be, we're in the process of commissioning a NACUA-like legal advisory for colleges and universities, so that college councils that get things from NACUA and kind of say, okay, here are some parameters, some tips, some guidance. We realize that even though we have this funding guide, it can be very helpful for HR and for legal counsels to also have something that's more directed towards lawyers. And so that should be coming out by the end of this academic year. I'm happy to talk more about that. The other thing that I want to mention and that we can talk about is, so what are these options, right? Here's an example of scholarships and fellowships. So we're not talking about tuition scholarships, right? That can be eligible for all students. These fellowships, right, depending upon what they are, can be. I have here also one of the things to talk about is tax implications. For students who have work authorization, who are not considered non-qualified aliens, they can get their full stipend. But if you are getting a stipend and you are an undocumented student, you will likely get withholdings on your stipend. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but that's important for the business office to know. What kind of information are you sharing with students? What kind of resources can you share with students? And letting students know so that it's not a surprise to them. That's really important. For those of you who work with international students, you may also know they also have different types of tax implications than domestic citizens or lawful permanent residents. We're not talking about employment today. We're not talking about independent contracting today. All of what we're going to talk about today, the resources are up on our higher ed immigration portal. And we're so thankful that the dream.us is one of our partners on the portal. So their information is also in our resources. We have a whole kind of resources page. We're adding to it. We'll be adding to it continuously. And so this is also something, as you're going through it, it can be shared with other faculty, staff, and students. One of our goals at the President's Alliance, and I think for me as having been the Vice President for Student Affairs, is that oftentimes in campuses, staff may know something, like HR sends it to the directors, or there's a conversation in the cabinet. But then as well, can we share this information more broadly? And then there's concerns. Well, do we want to share this information with all students? Do we want to put it up on our website? You know, does that make sense? And then what happens then is that because the information is not as visible about what the criteria and the processes are, there's confusion and miscommunication. So our goal as an organization is as much as possible to provide things that you yourselves can just link to us. You know, okay, well, here's what we're following and here's a portal. And that's to kind of help support your work while recognizing that oftentimes internal legal memos are not something that an individual institution wants to place on its website. So finally, this is also an example of what's on the resources page for the creating non-employment-based fellowship opportunities. We have things from Immigrants Rising. Some of these resources was also shown last week with Tanya. Our higher ed guide to funding, those charts that you saw were in the higher education guide to funding. We also have an FAQ that's based on what Lauren is going to be talking about. So the FAQs that also have some of those elements are a kind of complement to what Lauren will be talking about, and the PSEP program, that internship program that I talked about, that has funding that's inclusive to all students, as well as experiential learning. You're going to get it directly from Lauren. And then the income generation options for undocumented toolkit, that has more around independent contracting. I'm happy to also talk with this group about why at the President's Alliance, we ourselves are not pushing for colleges to engage more directly in offering independent contracting opportunities for students directly. We think it's great if you can share with them resources, but we understand there's some concerns for colleges to do too much directly with students around independent contracting. So let me just kind of close my kind of portion of this to say that overall, our approach to thinking about your positions is you need to review your positions. One of the things I know just from talking with Jackie is I think you've been doing such great work in trying to support students, but I also think that there's the tension between trying to be responsive to each individual student and trying to kind of be responsive to that situation that makes sometimes the work seem more ad hoc or one-off, or that there's more possibilities than actually probably there are if we systematize the possibilities. So to be working with students, say, yes, we're narrowing, maybe you may have been able to do X 2 years ago. Now we recognize that's not actually a fellowship or learning or leadership opportunity we can offer students without work authorization. Here's why. Here's our process. Here's what is visible, and trying to make it more visible. So there's a trade-off there. I will tell you, we did things in 2010 at Pomona that we recognized after we had an internal review and audit working with our lawyers, and you're getting the benefit of that. We recognize, you know what, we actually should not be doing that. And we kind of work through with students about those issues. Second, to really think about eligibility criteria for all that you're doing, for all the institutional scholarships, for all the institutional fellowships, and for your faculty. And I think there's some faculty also on perhaps, or you're working with faculty, to say, let's say you're an economics professor and there's an economic society fellowship or grant that students can apply for, but it says you have to be a citizen or lawful permanent resident. We actually think now's the time for all faculty, provost, deans, presidents, as it will be, to really push all of our external scholarship providers, all of our donors as appropriate, to make these positions as inclusive as possible to domestic immigrant students. I'm leaving aside, you may have reasons for it not to be open to international students on a visa, but to say it should be open to all domestic students, including domestic immigrant students. And then what Jackie's doing here, thank you so much, Jackie, of really taking a campus-wide approach is so critical. You're doing it, and I'm just in admiration of what you're doing. And again, saying, you know, identifying opportunities that fit the parameters of what's possible and being candid and clear about what's not. And then we can discuss it, I think, for both legal reasons, clarity reasons, buy-in reasons, to have a universal approach to experiential fellowships, to fellowship opportunities, and targeted outreach. Let me stop there, and before Lauren goes, to see if there are any questions. Did I confuse folks? All good? Okay, so now I'm turning it over to Lauren.
Great. So I'm going to talk about the campus fellowships for experiential learning. And so here what we have, I just wanted to give you all some context on how this came to be. And I also do want to acknowledge, like, there was so much work that was done prior to my arriving at Pomona that made this possible. So I certainly don't want to take credit for any of that, but I do want to acknowledge that there were people who were there prior to me, and even in my position, who I know had laid the groundwork. But in terms of context, so I want to take you back to fall 2017 at Pomona. And looking back, you know, the context is that experiential learning in the form of internship opportunities is huge. It's popular at the college. And there's something called the Pomona College Internship Program, or PSIP. Through that program, it had already been determined that no employer-employee relationship between Pomona and a student participating in off-campus internships existed. Because the funding for those opportunities was made possible through grants and scholarships, all to support students who are pursuing internships, whether domestic or abroad. And so that gave us, at least through PSIP, a framework for developing the fellowships program. So it was actually modeled off of that. Returning to PSIP, the internship program itself provided a stipend to offset the cost that was associated with unpaid and or low paid internship opportunities, both domestically and abroad. And so typically, you know, students would come to us with really great opportunities, and the whole philosophy of the program was no student should have to turn down a really great experiential learning opportunity because they can't afford that plane ticket to go to New York, or they don't have enough to figure out a housing sublet, or they can't afford maybe a tap card or a Metro card, right? And so it was really great because this program took that financial burden, or at least helped mitigate some of that financial burden for students, so they could just focus on that summer experience and have a great time. In terms of culture, there was a strong culture of students who used PSIP and understood that it was like the #1 resource on campus to make those opportunities possible. Otherwise, they wouldn't pursue them. And then in terms of the coordinating payment to students through the internship program with the business office, there was already a way to disperse funding through direct deposit or via a check. So a lot of that work was already done. And so that's context for how the experiential learning fellowships arose. So I'll talk a little bit about how the program was structured, and this is language right off of the website. And for more information, you can actually look up Campus Fellows Pomona College or check out the link below, which will also probably be in the chat later and also in a copy of the presentation slides. But if you want to pull that up on Google real quick and just take a look, you're more than welcome to. But this is how we crafted the language. And so we said that this opportunity offers students the chance to engage in independent, self-designed, project-based experience that was completed with the support of a staff person or a faculty advisor / mentor at the college. And a lot of the inspiration for this I actually got from something called the Senior Individualized Project at Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was something that I had learned about back in my posse days. And I thought, wow, that's such an interesting way to like structure a program for these seniors. It really gave them a lot of leeway to develop, you know, not just my thesis, but I could do a performance art piece. I could be creative in how I wanted to, you know, present that final capstone project that would otherwise be a thesis on other campuses. And so in thinking about something that's project-based, non-employment, that seemed like, okay, that can be a really great way to go in terms of our program. So the Campus Fellows provides financial support for on-campus, non-employment-based experiential learning that enhances a student's self-understanding and knowledge of resources in support of their own academic and/or career aspirations. And the reason why the language was developed in this way is because we wanted it to be something that was for the benefit of the student and not language that could be construed as, oh, this could potentially be employment or be considered something that one would need work authorization for. So it was certainly something that, you know, they could have on a resume. They could write a couple bullet points about it. They could speak to, you know, managing their time, managing their project and the things they learned, right? And speak to that maybe in a professional, you know, maybe interview setting. It would allow them that opportunity to talk about it in that way. So in terms of the funding, $750 was what was available for students. And I want to say at the time there was enough to fund maybe between 7 and 10 students. So it was small, it's modest, but thankful that it was there, you know. And in terms of the projects themselves, what were students able to do? Well, one, it had to be something that would further a student's academic interest and or career development. And that was really led by the student themselves and their project proposal in terms of outlining, here's why I'm interested in X, here's my plan for achieving it. This is my ultimate you know, vision for this project that I want to have done by the end of the semester. And I've identified a mentor figure to kind of help me usher it along. So in terms of what the final product, it was a paper. Oh, I'm sorry. It was a paper. It could be a poster presentation. It could be an online website or portfolio that they talked about or hosted like a campus event, something where they got to showcase the work that they did and let others know also that, hey, this fellowship program exists. here's this cool thing I was able to do. Be on the lookout for, the application again, or at least go talk to Lauren in the career development office so she can tell you more about it. And then I think the only restriction in terms of the content of what they could do is it could be work related to their thesis, but it couldn't actually be their thesis because we weren't going to pay them to complete their thesis, basically. So that's that explanation of the fellowship program. So moving to the next slide, how did we develop, instructions for our applicants? So what we did is we thought, well, let's make this application as simple as possible. The internship program, TSIP, for example, that's a long, involved process, several short answer responses. They have to develop a budget and outline how they're going to use their internship grant. They had to also do complete panel interviews. And so they went through a pretty long process in order to secure that summer funding. With something like this, it was, do they have to jump through all these hoops? What is necessary for us to know? And what is going to be less intensive on the part of the student and then the part of me who is also having to manage this. So basically what we said was we wanted them to develop a project proposal. Tell us, about your project. Is it something that is short-term and feasible that you can do in the span of a semester? Can you commit like a minimum of 40 hours to it throughout the course of the semester at least? And that was like the scope that they had to work within. In terms of where the application was held on our campus, and that may vary at other campuses, right? But because this was housed in the career development office, it made sense to put it on our career portal, which is Handshake. And so some of you may be familiar with Handshake, but basically we created a position there, labeled it as a fellowship, and then put in our criteria and the materials we wanted students to submit. So all we wanted to see was an unofficial transcript just to ensure they were in good academic standing. Provide us with a resume so we can see, what have you been involved with on campus? How does this kind of fit into your career narrative at this point? And then the project proposal. So the proposal itself, short, between 250 to 500 words. And we did want this to be something that whoever they were going to identify to work on this with for the semester, we wanted that person to sign off on it, that they were aware that this is what the student wanted to work on, that it was something that could be completed in the semester, and that, they would be committed to helping the student along the way get that project to completion, and actually have a final product to submit. So in terms of the selection committee, it could honestly, like this could consist of other staff and faculty, other student affairs staff. It could be just career development staff. I mean, in our case, it was myself and a few other colleagues in our office who reviewed, made sure that so long as they hit those 3 criteria, that the project was sound, they were in good academic standing, and it seemed like a really interesting, compelling project, then why not fund it? We also wanted to highlight, once the projects were done and completed, we wanted to highlight that on the Pomona College website, again, to draw attention and promote the opportunity and promote the work of the students. And we were very explicit on the website, on multiple pages, saying that this is not a salaried or shift position and that our fellows were not campus employees. So in terms of what you see here on this slide, and again, more information at the website linked there below, but you can see how we explained eligibility. We were explicit about saying all class years were welcome. All majors are eligible, including those who are undeclared. When we talked about how fellows are selected, it was, again, just identify and design this project, something feasible you can complete, and that you have, have a mentor, faculty or staff person sign off on it, that they'll support you through it. And then the payment would be awarded in 2 pieces. So the first piece is at the beginning when they begin their project, and then the second piece would be given after they submitted their project. And that was just the way of keeping students accountable, that they would actually complete what they said they set out to do. So this other piece about
Lauren, I think you're breaking up. You're breaking up for me.
because it actually got a little complicated, as we're talking with different student affairs offices. I know the student activities office, there was the recreation office, and they had really great ideas of, okay, yeah, we'd love to participate, we'd love to have a fellow, and here are the things we'd like them to do. And as we're thinking about the things they want them to do, we're like, that's a student worker position, that's employment, that's something that a student would already be doing, and so how can we change it and modify it so that it can't be construed that way? And that was challenging. I don't know that we, those projects from that first semester there, I recall that there was one where a student wanted to reorganize a library and create a section that really highlighted a particular, I forget the field of interest, but wanted to do that. And while it was a great project and it was really thoughtful and thought it would be, a great benefit for her, it was, oh no, that can be construed as a benefit for that particular office, because again, that work is something that either a student worker or a regular employee would be doing. And so it was, how could we encourage these students to create projects that were only going to benefit them, not necessarily the office that they were being hired to participate as fellows. So we went back to the drawing board and we decided, okay, let's change it up a bit and see what happens next. So that's where this mentor piece comes in. Instead of going to offices and asking them to participate, I mean, we figured these students, they're close to staff, they're close to faculty, they're probably already being mentored by somebody who has a vested interest, right, in their academic development, their research interests or passions, or even career development. And so if they already are working with somebody, let's have them simply propose a project they want to work on, ask their mentor, find a staff person or faculty person to just support them through it, make sure that they sign off on it, and then just make sure that the student is held accountable to actually produce it by the deadline, so that they've accomplished those goals that they set out with in their project proposal. So that's how that changed. And so what have we learned through that? One, I think the most important thing was having an institutional champion in student affairs and in career services. Miriam was certainly that at Pomona. I think, after she had left, that was myself in the office. A couple of years later, looking back at the Pomona website, my name is still listed there as the contact for campus fellows. So my sense is, these things, they're tied to people in certain offices. And when people transition, what is the plan in place to make sure there's continuity so that we're not having the same conversations over again, or at least leaving a trail of documentation of here's what to do, here's who to talk to, here's where you can go to, I think is really helpful. And not just in student affairs, but as Miriam had said before, in human resources, so that they know, okay, that they're not on payroll, they're not considered an employee, so that the business office is aware of the tax implications and how to issue direct deposit. If we can't give a student direct deposit, they don't have a bank account, can we give them a check, and then the student can still get their funding? How do we make that possible? Another thing that we had learned is, developing a consistent message for staff, faculty, and students was important because, whenever we're starting something new, I think it's a challenge to, first we want to say, okay, what are the goals and what are we trying to accomplish? Who are we serving? How are we going to get there? And sometimes, we can have, or rather I can have this idea, and then as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing, okay, there's a gap in understanding, or there's a misconception about what this program is. And so how do I make sure that that's clear, and that anyone who's talking about it or promoting it to students or anything like that understands what it is and what it isn't. So I'll say that. In terms of the application process, I think it's important that it be simple as possible, only collecting what is absolutely necessary and not making students have to go through so many steps and hoops to complete things, because that's already something they experience when, applying to internships or applying to other opportunities. It's time intensive, and sometimes students, they're high achievers. They're looking for opportunities, and sometimes that can be a barrier to students even engaging if they see, oh, there's like 24 things I need to do. I don't have the time to do it in. This sounds cool, but because I don't have time, I'm not going to pursue it. And I wouldn't want a student to say, I'm not going to engage with this because I don't have the time, due to the application process being intensive. The other thing that I learned and that I think is really helpful, and I was really grateful for this, was the engagement with the stewardship, fundraising, development, and alumni relations team. That's a ton of people. And at Pomona, I think I was very lucky in that this is a small campus. I can walk to that office, talk to exactly the person I need to talk to, and we can all be on the same page in terms of these greater goals. At larger campuses, that might be impossible to do or not as easy to do as one would hope. But I think having the support, or at least having an ear on the ground and kind of knowing what's going on in development and fundraising and with alumni relations, is important, because that's how one might be able to get additional funding or additional support, or at least awareness out there to build up funding for the program. In terms of other lessons, again, featuring fellows and their projects on the school website, just again to garner interest and then recognize them for their achievement. They put in the work. This is supposed to be a passion project of theirs that they're really excited about, and it's nice to just highlight them and give them that recognition. I think that's important. And that can look different at other campuses too in developing the programs. It could be a website, it could be an Instagram page, it could be a newsletter where every week, a student, is featured, or a fellow gets featured. I think is cool. In terms of other lessons, working with the business office is certainly important, because one has to figure out a way to disperse funding. Either is the issue of, do students don't have social security numbers? Can they fill out an I-9? Well, why are we asking them to fill, or a W-9 rather? Well, why are we asking them to fill out a W-9? And can they get an I-10? How do they get an I-10? Some of these students that I recall actually did have I-10s, and then some students wrote in progress or currently applying for one on that form. And so long as they had something like that, even just saying in progress on the W-9 form was okay for the business office, because they could on their end process the checks or process the direct deposit. At least in terms of checks, I know that there were at least 2 students who didn't have bank accounts, but in those particular cases, we can simply issue a check and then they'll be able to go and cash it. Working with the business office, I think that's a theme here, is that it's just important to understand what paperwork they ask students to fill out in order to get funding. So I know for us, they wanted to see, we want a W-9 filled out. We need the offer letter saying that they got this fellowship. We need to see a bank statement so that we can set up their direct deposit. some of the stuff we might ask for might not be necessary. A student might not have to give, their bank information. It's like what is absolutely necessary for us and for the institution and for the business office so that the student can get their funding. Because there might be some things we're asking for that maybe are irrelevant. And I think that's similar to the application process, right? We're asking for things, is that necessarily relevant? So that's that in terms of lessons learned. My hope, now that I'm at USC, I'm learning about, internships. I'm learning about opportunities, and it's a work in progress in terms of seeing, how might something like this develop at that institution. But that's my piece.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So now we want to open this up for questions, comments, discussion.
Thank you so much for that, both Miriam and Lauren. That really appreciate all that information. So you actually do have a question in the chat, and then I have a couple questions too. So Mark asked, does allowing students to receive the stipend for the fellowship have any relation to if they have a student account balance or not? At DU, there's a lot of talk of not being able to provide students any funding of any kind if they already are fully funded for tuition fees, housing, etc.
Lauren, do you want to start?
Yes. So in my time with the program, and even thinking about the internship program, it didn't matter if there was an account balance or not. They were still able to receive the funding. I know sometimes, there can be hold on student accounts due to certain, issues, but they were still able to get it. And even if there was a student who had already received like scholarship funding as part of their financial aid package, or, there are plenty of students who were Questbridge scholars or Gates Millennium scholars, this was still something that they could apply to and receive. And that didn't mean, because they were already receiving funding, didn't mean they couldn't also apply to this.
Right, it was a separate, so it didn't affect, there are other ways where overfunding, right, can make a difference on how it's given. But because these were kind of, these fellowship opportunities were considered apart from what the college was giving and was not counted by the financial aid office.
Great. So, and I appreciate that answer. And I would agree with you that that's what it logistically makes sense. Since this is, of course, being recorded, and I think some other folks, I just want to be clear. So what I think the issue is that if we were to give students money over their balance, right? So then that would be giving them money, which therefore would seem as though we were paying them, which would not work, as that would need to be taxed or that would be illegal. That is not the case, correct, with this type of program?
So I want to be clear that the funding from the fellowships or the internships could be taxable. That was very clear, that the business office said they could be taxable. And if you look at the funding guide, Laura and I were just discussing this previously, is that it actually also says that for some fellowships, for non-qualified, so non-tuition fees, fellowships and scholarships, for non-qualified aliens who are not on an F1 or J1, there could be a 30% tax withholding.
Yes.
And one of the things also, and again, to this, I should have said right up front, right? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not providing legal advice. I'm not a tax expert. I'm not providing tax advice to this group. But one of the things that we recognize is the importance of resources to students, to tell students, keep your receipts, right? Because you may get this withholding, but there are ways in when you do your taxes that you can show, right, if you're filing what you have, what should be deductions, qualified deductions for getting this. And so I think this is an area that campuses, and if I remember from my conversation with Jackie, Dominican may already be providing some resources to tax experts for students. And I think that's important. And again, that clarity ahead of time, You know, so it's not a surprise to students. When we first started this work, it actually was a surprise. You know, we didn't say to students that first years when this was happening, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, what is this? So we learned, but now I think, you know, this was many years ago, but now I think that we know, even though colleges are very clear, they don't provide tax advice to students, but to tell students, you not only do you need it, but for kind of campuses, where can they find it? Right? What kind of support? Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Miriam. I have kind of a follow-up question. And maybe Lauren, you might know a little bit more about this, how this impacted students at Pomona. So I'm wondering about, you know, similar to Mark's question, how this might impact a student whose cost of attendance is already completely covered, how it might impact their financial aid, if at all. It sounds to me like from what you're saying, it doesn't have to actually impact their financial aid.
Yeah, in my experience, it wasn't something that impacted their financial aid. It was something apart. It was considered apart. And I think even at USC, if I recall correctly, with a couple internship programs that I've been learning about, it doesn't impact their financial aid because it also has to do with how the money's categorized, like call it a stipend or call it a grant. So at USC, I know for one program, their internship stipends, and due to the timing that the funding comes, because it's happening later in the summer, it isn't counted as part of like a financial aid package. It wouldn't affect them.
Yeah, and I think just to add to this, you know, student employment on campus is much more directly counted as part of the financial aid package. So for example, the resident associates, the resident assistants in residence halls, this was an issue between also kind of how many positions they were working and how they were considered, you know, if they went over their fully funding, which we recognize harms the institution. But these fellowships and grants did not have to be categorized, as Lauren said, in this way. We were also part of the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program. And we also structured the Mellon Mays stipends this way. So it was apart from. So I think there are ways to do it, both in terms of some of the timing issues for some things, but also in terms of the categorization. I recognize that that's a good question. And that's why it's important to bring financial aid. And I don't know if there are folks in the financial aid office here, certainly to incorporate them in the conversations, and also to, you know, start out with the approach of, you know, how can we be aligned with the regulations and the law, and what are some creative solutions, right? So it's kind of working together with both of those.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So another kind of follow-up question on that, that I know folks have asked me about it is, you talked a little bit about this, but where the funding comes from. So if you talked about auditing our positions and understanding where we could actually sort of transform some of our current positions into a fellowship that's more inclusive. So how do you recommend, or how have you seen ways of funding these, right? Can it come from department budgets? Does it need to come from private funding?
So if I can start, and Lauren jump in as well. It's one of the things that reminded me, I'm so glad you asked, Jackie, because as Lauren was talking about creating the positions in 2017, I actually went to the, I went to my division and I said, I am going to take $5,000 from our student wage budget. So at Pomona, there was a student wage budget. And that I said, I'm taking a portion from, you know, I'm just taking this out. taking it from people's from what people had in student affairs. So some people are going to lose money and not, you know, and not have the opportunity to work with a fellow. And then I went to the cabinet with my other vice presidents, and I was like, okay, I want to take $5,000. I'm doing $5,000 from student affairs, but I want $5,000 from the general budget, student wage budget too. And got those, but it was hard for some folks because, as Lauren said, it's really not about just changing the name of it. It's not as though you're going to get it back in another way. It's just this new opportunity. Legally, just in case anyone had any questions, you can take your student wage budget, something that had been going through payroll, and then turn it into a fellowship or a grant. There's nothing legally, you know, from our conversations with the lawyers, what we learned, that was fine. So some people were concerned of if it originally had sat in a student wage pool, was that a problem? No. So that's what we did institutionally. I also think, and I'd love to hear Candy's thoughts about this and whether this is something, right, as long as it's not federal work study. Thank you, John. Yes, this was institutional funding. So institutional funding, not at all, nowhere near the federal work study programs. Thank you for that clarification, making sure that I made that clarification. But I also think that this is something that could be fundraised with alumni or other donors, or the Dream.us may have some good ideas about it. The Dream.us may come up, let me just suggest something for Candy, come up with a pool of $30,000, $50,000, in which Dream.us partner colleges can have their students apply for and be doing something on their campus if they're not already doing something about that, right? That's something that can be done. So it's, you know, Dream.us is providing funds, or it could be a funder possibility. And it's a great opportunity for both students and staff and faculty to think about this, but of course, in close coordination with your development folks. Candy, what do you think about that idea? Should you develop a $50,000?
It's a wonderful idea. It would require, just so you know, 100% of the funding that we have is dedicated to scholarships. So any additional funding that we do has to have a new donor that's willing to fund it. So this last year, as you all may know, because students did not get funds from the CARES Act, we actually did a $500 emergency grant, and we gave that to all students for any purpose. And that also had that similar question of, well, wait a minute, does this count as financial aid? And our argument was no, it is not financial aid for their college costs. It's for whatever costs they might have. So we did that same thing, Lauren, where we had to address that issue. We have had colleges who have gone to their donors, and they have been very receptive to this idea of allowing them to use funds, and sometimes funds that would have been used for scholarships to be allowed to use for fellowships. So it is definitely worth exploring.
Thank you so much, Candy. Really, really appreciate that. What are some other, you know, one of the things, and again, I'm interested in is, do you think this is these kinds of positions or the differentiation between being a research assistant and then doing this type of program, or being a student mentor? You know, one of the things we found at Pomona, as I mentioned, students couldn't be resident assistants. They couldn't be mentors in our mentoring program, where the students were getting paid because that was for the college. We certainly had some things in which faculty and staff had difficulty understanding what it means to have the nature of the work not be employment-based. How has it been at Dominican?
So Miriam, it looks like actually Ange has a question that's similar to what you're asking. Do you have a suggestion of how a student internship would be adapted in order to be a fellowship, such as a student intern in the admissions office?
So, hi, Ange. So, you know, one of the things that we have suggested for students, and Lauren, tell me, you know, this is an idea, right? You can have a lot of students want to do videos about their college, about the history of their college, about what's great about their college, about, you know, different students. And it's part of their, it could be part of communications, you know, it could be part of their art, their media. And there could be, for example, a project that's multimedia that a student does, a student fellow that's connected to the admissions office that learns more about the history of admissions from what's going on and how it's evolved, and has a project that will be, or it could be a blog or a podcast that actually the admissions office would be happy to share out, because it's great. It's kind of sharing kind of the insider look, or has a history of the college, but it's not being an orientation, you know, it's not being a tour guide. It's not being someone in the office. So I think there are ways that you can brainstorm that could be overseen and supported and mentored by someone in admissions, but that's an authentic project. Lauren, I don't know what your ideas could be.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the ideas you shared, because I think it will come down to, like, is this something that, you know, a student intern who's considered an employee or an employee already in that office, is that something that they would do? So it's this question of benefit. Is it benefiting that office, or is it benefit to the student? And so I think it just has to be framed in such a way that it's of benefit primarily to the student. And then it's not work that could be construed as this would be in, you know, this is an intern's duties or an employee's duties. Like sharing the project, like if the office wants to promote, right, the student's podcast or this fellow's podcast, I think I think it just has to be the language one uses to say, hey, you know, check out this work a fellow did. Not necessarily saying like this is a product of like the admissions office, like official, you know, admissions material that is going on. Because then I think that makes it feel more like it's employment.
Yeah, we had some offices that really could not, you know, like the dean of students office, right? There was too much of, when we had students that were too much really the primary benefit of the office, rather than the women's center or some others.
So it's not that we couldn't use what a student produces for our departments or offices. It's more that it can't be sort of something that is solely for promoting the work of that particular office.
Yeah, it has to be primarily for the benefit of the student. And it's work, that's the whole point about also saying we share this on websites, right? And so I think it's something that can be shared, but it's not a deliverable for the office. And it should be shared as a fellow's work. We have these fellows in, you know, on the campus. I will also say that, again, we didn't distinguish, there were certainly US citizens or lawful permanent residents who were experiential learning fellows at the college. So that also made it, you know, I think that's also important.
One question I have, and this has to do, oh, sorry, John, you were just about to talk, so this has to do obviously with payment. So you use I don't over CRAs, but you use the example of the resident assistants. So our resident assistants get their room and board paid for as part of their job, but then they get a small stipend per month. If we wanted to hire, or we wanted to have an undocumented student as a resident assistant, and they said, fine, I'll do it because I want to get the housing that's part of it that isn't actual money being exchanged, but I won't take the stipend. Is that something that's able to be done? So I also oversee orientation leaders, and we always have undocumented orientation leaders because a number of our students are undocumented, and that story is at the core of who we are. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, full disclosure, is figure out how to design projects that are going to allow undocumented students to have a part within orientation.
Right. I think so I would, for the first part, and again, not a lawyer, no legal advice, but I would say it's really hard to put undocumented students without work authorization in positions that are employment-based positions, even if the compensation is in the form of room and board and a small stipend. So I think from my own experience, having done that in the early years, you know, a dozen years ago, and then having recognized that there were issues there, I recommend not doing that. You know, again, it's kind of working through with students. Yes, we used to have this opportunity, but now we don't. But what we just said about podcasts and other kinds of projects related to admissions, I think that we also did discover some projects related to orientation. But it was actually a what the students thought, and so did we, a very cruel irony that the head mentors who got paid at Pomona of the undocumented student group, that we had I don't know how many, like almost 10 or a dozen mentoring groups for all different populations, that those students had to have work authorization because the head mentors were clearly, even though they were it was important for themselves, but it was a position. And this, I think, is also part of the tension for institutions in which students want to get paid for their work that they're doing. They used to be all these volunteer positions, and then it would be very hard for low-income students to do because they had to work to get paid. And so institutions are like, yeah, we should start paying, the students, so it doesn't just privilege well-off students, but then they became employment-based, and that that excluded another group. And this is the kind of conversation to have, on the campus, which I think is really important.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question, because I think the question of benefit is still tricky to me. So we have a couple of programs in university ministry, which are cohort-based leadership and ministerial formation programs, right? So there's clear benefit to the students. They're privately funded. We don't use any university funding right now to support those positions. We haven't reallocated anything. We've actually got them funded through grant and foundation work. The students receive a $1,400 stipend, $2,800 for the year for 100 hours in the fall, 100 hours in the spring. It is framed as a stipend, and we have them go out into the community for 2 of the programs and work with community partners. And this is where the line about deliverables becomes challenging, right? Because they do have deliverables for the community partners, but there is a formative component that's explained, and there's a community partnership agreement with the community partner that explains that that this is a sort of a framed as experiential learning. And the community partner in those programs does benefit from it. Now, we've realigned our internal peer ministry program to be structured in the exact same way. But I clearly see how we have deliverables for the office, right? My graphic designers design for us, and they have a deliverable that we're going to use. So that's different. I'm wondering about how it works with community partners and things that are akin to work in the field, but ultimately are framed as like leadership formation, professional development.
So I'll start and see if Lauren, I think the community partners model, these are, it's almost like the off-campus internships in which they're, being funded. There's no employer-employee relationship between the college and the student. They're just part of the cohort of these students of this program working with community partners.
Right.
And to me, that's separate. That seems really doable and viable. I'm
Okay.
not sure whether you're also saying, though, for example, I have a peer mentoring program on campus. So they're working on campus and they're doing the work with the groups on campus. And they're also getting paid for that work. That would be, that to me, that's a, that needs some more exploration, but not with the community partners. To me, it says those that they get selected to be part of this program. And it comes with, you know, and maybe it even comes, John, it would be great if it came, and this is what we did at Pomona with Mel and May's undergraduate fellowship, is that we put a curriculum base. It was actually a 1 credit course with the faculty mentor, who would then bring the students together once a week or once every other week to talk about their, you know, they were keeping some logs and they were they had some readings, and we sometimes had guest speakers. So there was a curriculum basis to it. They were doing their work, and the fellowship it was like you're a scholar. You were getting.
Yeah, we have, I mean, that's the one advantage that I see in the way the program is constructed now. We have a weekly theological reflection that's built with learning goals and things like that. And because of that, there's pretty easy translation into credentialed or credit bearing experiences, right? We offer that right now as an internship credit, but we're exploring with the theology department just offering the credit every semester if a student wanted to take it while they're in the program. They could take it or not take it, but it's offered.
Exactly. And we also did things for our internships, for example, in which it was a credit. It did not count towards graduation credit. So it was a notation.
Zero credit.
But it was a notation on the transcript. And I can imagine you doing something like that for on campus. Go ahead, Lauren. My apologies.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you know, for our internship program, we offered transcript notation, and that was a way of legitimizing that experience, you know, co-curricular experience. And so, you know, I know we did receive questions from students who were saying, that's great that I get this credit and it's great that it's on my transcript, but, you know, why can't it count towards my graduation credits? And it's just, that's how it was structured. But I think, you know, the question of having something where, you know, that can just be offered, you know, or having an internship course be offered for students who want to take it, because that's also something that happens for students who, you know, it might be an unpaid opportunity, but they need to receive academic credit in order to do the opportunity. And so long as they're enrolled in an internship course that has, right, that structure and curriculum, then that could satisfy those requirements from the employer and make it possible for them to do their internship.
John, I have a question for Miriam, but also just John. In my experience, we were exploring credit options for the PLTL program, and at Dominican, students prefer the 0 credit because for Lauren and Miriam at Dominican, if you go from 12 to 18 hours, it's the same cost. And so a lot of my students, they're at 18 hours already, and they don't want to bump up to 19 for that credit. So just a comment on the credit hours. I have a question. I run the peer-led team learning program. It's in the STEM. It's in the STEM courses, and so it's a tutoring and mentoring program. And I would be curious. And you know, not everybody needs to hear about this right now, but I would just be curious about learning more about the Emory TA program that they were able to have undocumented students participate in that program, because that seems kind of similar to what I'm doing. So I'd be very curious to learn how they structured that. And to make undocumented students eligible for participation.
Absolutely. And Kate, I will send you the Emory. I think that it may even be in the funding guide, the link to the Emory, but I'll see if I can send it to you, and would love to talk more with you. That's one of the things we've asked the lawyer for the legal advisory to explore a little bit, so that so colleges would have that example.
Yeah, that would, because like, I mean, they are doing tutoring for us, but the mentorship that they receive and as students, the growth they get from it is huge. And we have weekly, I call them meetups because they don't get credit, but they're almost like a class, right? And so we already have that component, but it's not, you know, like how can I phrase it? How can I structure it so that we get over that limitation?
Maybe one of the things that Dominican then to explore is notations on transcripts that are not credit bearing.
Mm-hmm. I know that's something we've been discussing in general, because also we'd like to make sure that we're exploring that students are having equitable access to opportunities. And if we're capturing them on transcripts, we're more able to note if there's equitable access to all these opportunities.
Exactly. Great point, Kate. Yeah, and I also think that the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship, in which it was a cohort program that provided that was tied to the curriculum and provided stipend for independent work, was another way that you know can be explored. But of course, for all this, it means it's how do you reallocate funding, right? Or how do you identify new funding sources? And do you think there's an issue about having things that are open? You know, I don't know whether one of the approaches in Dominican was, let's find something for this undocumented student, or do you think that there's an appetite, let's find something that could be for a group of students, which can also be inclusive then for undocumented students? Do you think that's already the place where you're going, or are you trying more to find, how can I support this one student in X?
I think it would be support for all students, and I can just speak for myself, but something also in this conversation that has raised a question for me, if I was to have a program that wasn't inclusive for everybody, you know, you don't want to have to ask students what their documentation status is. And so some of my students are going to have DACA, some of them are going to be undocumented, and those differences. And so I'm just curious how people navigate communicating opportunities to students and making sure you're sensitive to them not having to share personal information with you that they don't feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I mean, sometimes it's very clear that, you know, you can either say this is an employment-based position or requires work authorization. A lot of scholarships and grants, as you know, will sometimes say only open to citizens or lawful permanent residents or those in refugee status. Those are the kind of things that we have to ask why, right? So the federal work study, well, because we know about right now, Pell and work study and loans are not open to what's called non-qualified aliens. Some science foundation from the government is only open to certain populations, and they say it on their criteria. Oh, that's good to know. The Schmidt Scholar, you know, that's widely available. You can say, here's model language, right? And work also saying, here's the way to make it clear. Here's the way when it's not.
Yeah, some of your ideas are similar to an idea that I've been thinking about for STEM research opportunities for students, because STEM research is almost solely funded by the National Science Foundation. And then anybody who's supported by that has to be reported back in the end value for people impacted. And so thinking about ways that Dominican can fund undocumented students to do research in another university's lab is something that I've been contemplating about. We have kind of like this network of schools, and so this helped me think further along those lines.
Yeah, and sometimes those schools and those programs just automatically use the same language as the government when they don't need to, because the funding's not coming from the government, right? And they're really research projects. It's not going, they're getting paid maybe by you, they're getting paid from a source. That's why we're really recommending to faculty to ask their societies and their organizations that sometimes have these scholarships and grants and summer opportunities, can it be more inclusive? Because it was just a default, and the default was very understandable because a lot of these programs were not open to international students and still are not open to international students on a visa. But it's now caught up all these domestic immigrant students.
There is precedence in at least the STEM field to provide your own funding for opportunities. It's called You Come With Funding. I'm really familiar with the Canadian system, and that's a really common one there. You'll apply for a graduate position or a postdoc fellowship, and you'll say you come with NSERC funding. And so I think a model like that, where you come with funding, would make more opportunities available if Dominican could think about that, funding students, because they're happy to have you in their lab. That's not a problem. It's just a question of how do you get paid, and then how do they make it an official relationship for liability's sake and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to what you said earlier, Miriam, you had mentioned that having actually a systematized approach eliminates the burden of having to have all of these individual conversations. And I think one of the things that would also benefit the university, in addition to sort of the models that Lindsay had placed into the chat, is just having designations or classifications and a common language, so that we knew, like, if we were going to use employment-based opportunities, then employment-based opportunities includes peer leaders, Waters internship, et cetera, down the line. And then non-employment-based opportunities includes a whole host of others with a directory that like serves everybody, and is a kind of a universal clearinghouse for that experience for students, so that they can navigate that on their own and don't have to disclose status, right?
That's great. Exactly.
Alrighty, so we're at the very end of our training. So thank you all so much. Some of you sent me great ideas via the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and review these, and we'll have conversations with some folks that have been helping to plan these events, these workshops. Miriam and Lauren, thank you so much for your time today. I know Dream US folks are here as well. Thank you so much for joining and for being with us 2 weeks ago. We are so grateful for your time, and I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much, all of you. It was so wonderful engaging with you. Thank you so much, and look forward to future conversations. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks.